In a quiet countryside village, far from the noise of cities, there stands a house no one dares to enter. It's called Ashwood House. For decades, it has remained untouched. Its windows are broken, its doors warped with age, its garden overrun with wild thorns. Yet, strangely, the house never collapses. It stands, watching. Locals tell the same story. Anyone who dares to stay inside Ashwood House for a single night never survives until dawn. Some vanish without a trace. Others are found, but not alive. Their bodies discovered at sunrise, faces frozen in terror, mouths open as though they had seen something beyond comprehension. The village children whisper about shadows moving behind the windows, even though no one lives there. Farmers crossing the fields late at night swear they hear faint screams carried by the wind long after midnight. And every year, without fail, someone new, an outsider, hears the legend and thinks it's just a story. They decide to prove the villagers wrong. None of them ever succeed. This is the tale of one such night. The night someone entered Ashwood House and discovered why no one survives until morning. The story begins with Daniel Price, a writer in his mid-30s. He was not a superstitious man. In fact, he made his living exposing myths, unraveling legends, and proving that most so-called hauntings were nothing more than tricks of the imagination. Daniel had heard of Ashwood House through an old newspaper clipping. It described the mysterious deaths of two young travelers who had dared to stay the night. To Daniel, this was an opportunity, not for adventure, but for his next book. Armed with a camera, a voice recorder, and a journal, Daniel arrived in the village just before sunset. The air was heavy, as though the sky itself was warning him. The villagers noticed him immediately. Strangers were rare here. An old man outside the tavern squinted at him, pipe smoke curling around his face. "You're heading to that house, aren't you?" the old man asked, his voice like grave. Daniel smiled politely. "That's the plan." The man shook his head slowly. "Don't. No one makes it past midnight." Others nearby turned to listen, their faces pale, their silence thicker than words. But Daniel didn't believe in curses. He believed in evidence. And evidence required experience. So, as the last rays of sun dipped below the hills, Daniel walked the lonely dirt path toward Ashwood House. The house loomed in the distance, dark against the fiery sky. Its roof sagged in places, the walls mottled with rot and age. The front gate was twisted, hanging loosely on one hinge. As Daniel stepped inside, the iron gate shrieked, a sound so sharp, so piercing, it seemed to echo across the empty fields. The garden was wild, with weeds tall as his waist. Thorny vines wrapped around broken statues and half-buried stone steps. Everything about the place felt abandoned, yet alive. When he reached the front door, he paused. The wood was swollen, the paint peeled away long ago. Carved faintly into the wood were strange symbols, circles and jagged lines, faded by time. He pressed a hand against the door. It felt cold. Not the natural chill of wood at night, but something else. A cold that seemed to seep into his skin, crawling up his arm. Still, Daniel pushed the door open. It groaned on rusty hinges, revealing the darkness inside. The air smelled of mildew and old smoke, thick enough to choke. Dust danced in the thin shaft of moonlight cutting through a broken window. And then, silence. The kind of silence that isn't empty, but heavy. As though something was listening. Daniel switched on his recorder. His voice sounded strange in the vast hallway, hollow, as if the house was swallowing his words. October 12th, 8:15 p.m., entering Ashwood House. Atmosphere thick. Air quality poor. Initial impression. Unsettling. But explainable. His words were calm, but his heart was not. Every instinct in his body whispered, "Turn back." But Daniel ignored it. As he stepped inside, the door behind him slammed shut on its own. And in that instant, he realized he was no longer welcome. Daniel clicked on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the grand entrance hall. The space was enormous, its ceiling lost in shadows. A broken chandelier hung above him, its crystals dull with dust, like the dead eyes of something that once glittered. The walls were lined with portraits, their faces almost obscured by grime. Yet, when the light touched them, Daniel felt an uncanny sensation. It was as though the painted eyes followed him. He shook it off. Pareidolia, he thought. The mind invents faces, movements, when there are none. He'd written about it before, but still, he avoided looking at the portraits too long. His boots crunched on the wooden floor, brittle with age. He moved slowly, speaking into his recorder. Main hall. Large. Gothic in style. Likely late 1800s architecture. Portraits, multiple generations of the same family, perhaps the Ashwoods themselves. As he approached the staircase, he froze. There was a sound, a single creak like a footstep from the floor above. Daniel's flashlight darted to the ceiling. Dust rained down from the boards, settling on his jacket. He stood still, breath held. Nothing. Silence. He exhaled slowly, shaking his head. House is shifting. Old timber often settles. Not unusual, but his voice was not steady. He explored the first floor, finding shattered furniture, mold-ridden drapes, and doors swollen shut from years of dampness. In the dining room, the long table still stood. Plates were set as if waiting for dinner, covered in cobwebs. He ran a finger across one of the plates. It left a clean streak, as if the dust was fresh. Too fresh. And then, another sound. This time it was unmistakable. Whispering. Low, faint, drifting through the walls. He spun, flashlight jerking across the room. "Hello?" His voice cracked. "Is someone there?" The whispering stopped. He forced a laugh, speaking again into the recorder. Possible wind interference through cracks, creating auditory illusions. But he couldn't explain why. As he turned, the dining chairs had shifted. Just slightly, their legs scraping faintly on the floor, as though someone had pushed them back to sit down. Daniel moved to the library next. Rows of rotting books lined the shelves. The smell of damp paper was overwhelming. One book lay open on the table, though no windows had been opened to move it. The pages were yellowed, brittle. Daniel leaned closer. It was a journal. The handwriting was spidery, frantic, smeared with ink. He read aloud. "The voices will not stop. They come closer each night. The walls bleed when the clock strikes 3. I begged her to forgive me, but she never does." Daniel swallowed hard, flipping the page. "If anyone finds this, know that the house is alive. It feeds on us. It waits. And it never lets go." The last page was torn, ripped out violently. Before he could react, something slammed shut behind him. The library door. Daniel ran to it, pulling the handle. It wouldn't budge. Locked. No, worse. From the outside, he could hear footsteps. Slow, deliberate, pacing just beyond the door. He banged on the wood. "Hey, who's there?" No answer. Only footsteps. Round and round, circling. And then, silence again. When he turned back toward the table, the book was gone. Only a cloud of dust remained where it had been. Daniel's hand shook as he fumbled with the recorder. 9:40 p.m. Library. Experiencing movement of objects. Likely prank, staged beforehand. Locals, perhaps. But even as he said it, he didn't believe his own words. He pressed his ear to the wall. For a moment, there was nothing. And then, clear, close, unmistakable, he heard it. A whisper. Right against the wood. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel staggered back, flashlight beam shaking wildly across the shelves. The door behind him creaked open. No one was there, but something had unlocked it. Daniel stepped into the hall, heart pounding. He was ready to leave. But when he turned to find the front door, it wasn't there. Where the grand entrance had been just minutes before, there was only wall. Old, cracked wallpaper. No door. No exit. Daniel froze. His breath caught in his throat. The house had changed. It had sealed him inside. Daniel's chest rose and fell in ragged breaths as he stared at the wall where the front door had been. Gone. Just gone. He ran his palm along the wallpaper, pressing against the boards. Solid. No seams, no frame, no door. The exit had vanished. He steadied himself, whispering into his recorder, though his voice trembled. 9:55 p.m. Main hall. The front entrance is no longer visible. Maybe a trick of perception. Possible structural shifting? Need to... He stopped. Somewhere upstairs, a piano note rang out. Just one. A low, drawn-out sound, vibrating through the silence. Daniel lifted the flashlight toward the staircase. The beam quivered in his hand. Old instrument, he muttered to himself. Wind through the strings. Nothing more. But he didn't believe it. He climbed the stairs, each step groaning under his weight. The smell of rot thickened as he reached the second floor. The hallway stretched out impossibly long, lined with doors. Some hung open, revealing glimpses of broken furniture. Others were shut tight. Halfway down the corridor, he found it. A music room. The grand piano sat beneath a cracked window, its lid raised. Dust covered the keys, but a faint print. A single handprint, pressed down on middle C. Daniel's flashlight beam lingered on the keys. For a moment, nothing. And then, another note. This time, higher. The key pressed down as if by an invisible hand. Daniel froze. His breath misted in the cold air. He turned sharply, shining the light behind him. No one. When he looked back at the piano, every key had sunk down, and then slammed up at once in a deafening crash of sound. Daniel stumbled backward, covering his ears. His heart raced, his pulse hammering in his throat. When the echoes faded, he heard something else. A voice, singing. A woman's voice, soft, mournful. A lullaby, floating through the air. Daniel followed it, drawn toward the sound like a moth to flame. The voice led him into a bedroom at the end of the hall. The wallpaper peeled in strips, the ceiling sagged with water stains. A rocking chair stood in the corner, swaying gently though no one sat in it. On the bed lay a diary, its leather cover cracked with age, its pages yellow. Daniel picked it up with trembling hands and read aloud. October 2nd, 1891. The house groans with her footsteps. She comes at night. She watches the children as they sleep. The next page was smeared with something dark, almost rust-colored. He flipped further. October 14th. The twins are gone. I found their shoes by the piano, but no trace of them. My husband says it is the house, that it feeds when the moon is full. I hear her voice now, singing, and the children answer. Daniel stopped reading, because the lullaby had grown louder. He lowered the diary, eyes wide. The rocking chair had stopped moving, and in its place, a figure, a woman, pale as paper, hair hanging in wet strands across her face. She sat in the chair, hands folded in her lap, her head tilted slightly, as though listening to him. Daniel's breath caught. He blinked, and she was gone. The chair sat empty again. Daniel dropped the diary, stumbling back into the hallway. His recorder slipped from his pocket, clattering onto the floor. Through the small speaker, his voice played back. But it wasn't just his voice. On the tape, beneath his words, another voice whispered. A woman's whisper, repeating a single phrase over and over. We remember. We remember. We remember. Daniel snatched up the recorder, his hands shaking so violently he could barely press the stop button. He turned, shining the flashlight down the hallway. And every portrait on the wall had changed. Where once they showed the Ashwood family, dressed in fine Victorian clothes, now the faces were blurred, distorted. Their eyes hollow, black voids that seemed to stare directly at him. Some mouths were open, as if screaming. Others were sewn shut with stitches crudely painted across them. The house was remembering. It was showing him what it held. Daniel stumbled into another room, desperate to escape the staring portraits. It was a child's nursery. A cradle stood in the center. The air was icy cold. He approached it slowly. Inside lay a doll. Porcelain, cracked, its glass eyes clouded. As he reached for it, the doll's head turned, just slightly, and then it began to cry. Not a mechanical cry, not a toy, a real baby's cry. Piercing, shrieking, filling the room with unbearable sound. Daniel dropped the doll, stumbling back as it rolled across the floor. The cry grew louder, echoing through the halls, as though dozens of children were wailing at once. He clamped his hands over his ears, shouting, "Stop! Stop it!" And then, silence. The cradle was empty. The doll, gone. Only Daniel remained, gasping for air. He pressed his recorder again, whispering hoarsely, 10:20 p.m. The house. It's not memory. It's presence. It knows I'm here. It wants me to see. I don't know why, but it's showing me what happened here. He looked around the dark nursery, flashlight beam shaking. Somewhere deep in the house, a clock chimed. Not midnight yet, but closer. And Daniel knew. The house was only just beginning. Daniel sank into the dusty corner of the nursery, clutching his recorder as though it were a weapon. His breathing was shallow, uneven. The crying had stopped. The rocking chair was still. But the house felt alive. The silence pressed against his ears, thick and heavy. And then, the clock chimed again. 12 slow, deliberate strikes. Midnight. The hour when, in every story he had ever researched, the haunting begins. The first strike echoed through the walls. The wallpaper rippled, as if the house itself were breathing. The second strike, Daniel felt the temperature plummet. His breath curled visibly in the air. The third, footsteps in the hall. Slow, heavy. Daniel gripped his flashlight, pointing it toward the nursery door. The beam trembled in his hand. The footsteps stopped. The fourth strike, a whisper, right behind him. He spun, shining the light. Nothing. But the whisper returned, this time from the far corner of the room. Then another, and another, until the entire nursery was filled with voices, whispering, overlapping, chanting in languages Daniel couldn't understand. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it made no difference. The voices weren't in the air. They were in his head. The fifth strike. Every toy in the room moved. The wooden horse rocked violently back and forth. Blocks scattered across the floor, spelling words that hadn't been there before. Daniel froze as the letters arranged themselves. L-E-A-V-E. The cradle slammed shut, the sound like a gunshot. The sixth strike, the whispers stopped. And then, slowly, the nursery door creaked open. Daniel stepped forward, his legs stiff with terror. He peered into the hall. Empty. But the portraits lining the walls had changed again. Now, every face bore his features. Daniel. Dozens of Daniels, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. The seventh strike. Every door in the hall slammed shut at once. The echo thundered through the house like cannon fire. Daniel stumbled backward, his recorder falling from his hand. It hit the ground, switched on. His voice filled the hall from earlier in the night. But it wasn't just playback. It was answering him, where his voice said, "Atmosphere thick, air quality poor." Another voice hissed over it, "Breathe deeper," where his voice said, "The house is alive." The echo whispered, "And hungry." Daniel snatched up the recorder, slamming it off. His heart felt ready to burst through his chest. The eighth strike, a door at the far end of the hallway creaked open. Only this one. A slow, deliberate invitation. Daniel raised his flashlight, swallowing hard. The light caught on something, moving, a shadow. But it wasn't cast by him. It stretched across the floor, long and twisted, even though there was nothing there to make it. The shadow slithered along the wall, pulling toward the open door. Daniel whispered to himself, "Don't follow. Don't follow." But his legs betrayed him. Step by step, he walked toward the door. The ninth strike. He entered what looked like the master bedroom. The bed was still made, but the sheets were dark, stiff, with old, dried blood. On the wall above the bed, words were scratched deep into the plaster. "She won't let us leave." Daniel shone the light across the room and froze. Every mirror in the room was covered with a white sheet, except one. And in that mirror, he saw her, the woman from the rocking chair. She stood behind him, her face half hidden by dripping strands of hair. Her eyes, black voids. Daniel spun around. No one. He turned back to the mirror. This time, The reflection showed not just her, but dozens. Men, women, children, all standing silently behind him, their mouths opened in unison, and a scream filled the room. The 10th strike. The mirror shattered, shards spraying across the floor. Daniel staggered back, shielding his face. When he lowered his arm, the figures were gone. But the sheets covering the other mirrors began to slide off, one by one.